Elijah Braxton was 36 years old the morning he came downstairs before sunrise to start the coffee and found his wife's diary sitting open on the kitchen counter, face up, splayed at its spine the way a book lands when it has been set down in a hurry. He almost did not look. He was not a man who read other people's things. He had been raised specifically against it. His grandmother had told him once, firmly and only once, that a person's private words were their architecture, and you did not walk uninvited through another person's walls. He had carried that into adulthood, the way he carried most of what she had given him, quietly, without needing to be reminded. But the page was already facing up, and his name was already there. Elijah, written in her looping cursive in the middle of a paragraph, and beneath it a second time, 2 lines down, and both instances were underlined. Twice, with the particular pressure of someone pressing meaning into paper. He stood at the kitchen counter for 3 seconds. He looked at his name. He looked at the window above the sink where the first gray light of a Charlotte morning was just beginning to show. He looked back at the diary. Then he read the page. It took him 45 seconds to read. He was a fast reader and a careful one, trained by years of reading structural blueprints where a misread line was not an abstraction, but a consequence. He read the page the way he read blueprints, fully, without skipping, registering every detail before forming any conclusion. When he finished, he set the diary back in its exact position, splayed at its spine, face up, precisely as he had found it. He started the coffee. He stood at the counter while it brewed and looked at the tile backsplash he had laid himself 3 years ago, and he thought with the complete stillness of a man who had just read the load-bearing truth of his own life. The page said that she was done pretending. The page said that she had made her decision 3 months ago and was simply waiting for the right time. The page said that Marcus, not Elijah, not her husband, a name he had heard once at a firm holiday party attached to a man with a firm handshake and a particular quality of attention directed at his wife, was the kind of man who understood her in ways Elijah apparently did not. The page said, in its final underlined line, that she felt like she had been wasting her best years. What the page did not say, what Camille Braxton had never asked, not in 7 years of marriage, not once, was what her husband did on his second phone, or why his financial advisor's office was downtown in the same building as 3 of the city's largest commercial landlords, or whose name appeared as principal on the engineering firm that had quietly won 4 of the last 6 major public infrastructure contracts in Mecklenburg County. What happened next would rearrange everything Camille thought she had already decided. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The mornings on Whitfield Lane had always been his best hours. Elijah was up at 5:15 without an alarm, the way he had been up at 5:15 since his early 20s when the habit had been necessity and had since become preference. He made the coffee strong, the way his grandmother had made it. She had told him once that weak coffee was an indication of weak commitment to the morning, and he had laughed, and she had not been joking. And he carried it to the table in the breakfast nook he had added to the back of the house 2 summers ago, a 12 by 14 edition, framed and drywalled by his own hands over 6 weekends, with a window seat running the length of the east wall so the morning light came in full and unobstructed. He had built the table, 2 black walnut, book-matched slabs, the grain running continuous across the join the way his grandfather had taught him to do it before his grandfather's eyes gave out. The table had taken him 4 months of weekend hours. It was the finest thing he had ever made with his hands, and he knew it. Without pride, simply as a structural fact. He was a civil engineer by training. Structural work by practice. He had spent the first 8 years of his career at a large regional firm. learning every system in the built environment with the patience of someone who understood that knowledge was not a shortcut, but a foundation. 4 years ago, he had left to start Braxton's Civil Group, which had grown faster than he had planned for and was now, by any external measure, a significant operation. Though the external measure most people applied to Elijah Braxton was the work boots and the company truck, and the way he moved through a room without requiring it to notice him. He had never corrected this impression. His grandmother had told him, "Baby, small men announce themselves. Big men wait to be discovered." She had been gone 2 years now, a Tuesday in February, a hospital room in Gastonia, her hand in his until it wasn't. And he heard her voice most clearly in the early morning quiet, in the nook he had built, at the table he had made. He had met Camille at a structural review meeting 7 years ago. She was an interior architect on the same mixed-use project, brought in for the finished specifications. And she had disagreed with him directly and specifically about the placement of a partition wall on the 3rd floor. She had been right. He had told her so immediately. She had been surprised that he said so, and her surprise had made him curious about her. And curiosity had led to coffee, and coffee had led to everything else. She was talented. She was certain in her opinions, which he had admired. She moved through social environments with the ease of someone who had always been interesting to other people, and had made a reasonable peace with the responsibility of it. In the first years it had been partnership, then warmth, then a slow and unremarked cooling, the kind you only measured in retrospect, when you laid the current temperature against the memory of what it had been. Her phone had changed its angle. Her evenings had developed new names attached to them, colleagues he had not met, events that did not require his presence. She came home from them energized in a way she had stopped being energized by him. He had noticed. He was a man who noticed everything. He had chosen to believe, for longer than he perhaps should have, that what he was noticing was the normal weathering of a long partnership and not the specific directed thing it turned out to be. The morning of the diary he was supposed to believe, he had not read it. He poured his coffee. He started his day. He built nothing that morning on paper. He sat in the nook with the east light coming in, and he thought through everything he knew and everything he needed to know, and he was still when he did it, fully, completely still, the way the best structures were still even under load. He was not afraid. He was not angry. He was measuring. He did not touch the diary again. He did not need to. What he had read in 45 seconds was sufficient to tell him the shape of the problem. What he needed now was not more of Camille's words, but the architecture beneath them, the specific, documented, verifiable structure of what had been built without his knowledge, and what remained to be understood. He left for work at 7:15 the way he always left, kissing Camille on the cheek in the kitchen while she drank her coffee and looked at her phone. She smelled of a different shampoo than she had used a year ago. He had registered this weeks earlier without remarking on it. He sat through 2 morning meetings without losing attention in either of them. At noon he called Patricia Okonkwo, who had been his business attorney since the founding of Braxton Civil Group. From the second phone he kept in his inner jacket pocket, the one registered to the holding company, the one Camille had never asked about. Patricia answered on the second ring. He said only, "I need an hour this week. Personal matter. Bring the full structure file." She said Thursday at 2. He said yes and ended the call. That evening he came home and made dinner, grilled fish, roasted vegetables, a simple meal prepared with the same deliberate attention he brought to every physical task. Camille came in at 6:40 and set her bag on the bench by the door and said the traffic had been bad. He agreed that the traffic had been bad. She asked about his day. He told her about the site review in concise and accurate terms. She listened with the partial attention of someone managing a parallel conversation inside themselves. The diary was no longer on the counter. She had moved it at some point during the day. He did not look for it. They ate at the walnut table he had made. She asked about a project timeline. He answered accurately. He asked about a client she had mentioned the previous week. She answered with slightly more detail than necessary, a pattern he now recognized as performance. He went to bed at 10. He lay in the dark and listened to the house settle. The particular sounds of a structure he knew completely. Every joist and beam and load path, because he had spent 3 years adding to and improving it with his own hands, and he breathed evenly and thought about Thursday at 2. He was not going to move early. He was not going to confront, or ask, or signal what he knew. His grandfather had told him once, standing over a warped piece of framing lumber, that the worst thing a builder could do was rush the foundation work. You can fix everything above the foundation, his grandfather had said. You cannot fix the foundation once the house is built on top of it. He was going to get the foundation right. The following morning, he arrived at the office at 7 and pulled the financial records for Braxton Civil Group's last 2 fiscal years and cross-referenced them against the joint account statements he had already requested from the bank. He was looking for a pattern. Within 40 minutes, he found one. 12 transfers over 9 months, small, between $800 and $2,200 each, always in the second week of the month, always from the joint savings to an account he did not recognize. Not irregular enough to trigger a bank alert. Irregular enough when laid in sequence to constitute a direction. His face remained perfectly calm. He moved with the same deliberate calm that defined all his actions. He photographed each statement on his second phone. He forwarded them to his own secure email. He built a simple timeline on a legal pad, date, amount, running total, and looked at it when it was finished. $19,400 over 9 months. He drew a box around the total. He set the legal pad inside a folder he labeled with the single letter B. He placed the folder in the interior compartment of his work bag. He went to his 9:30 meeting and was fully present in it. Patricia reviewed everything on Thursday with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had learned long ago that the first read was always for shape and the second read was for detail. She was 54, precise, with the contained energy of someone running several simultaneous thoughts and choosing which one to speak. She laid the documents in sequence across the conference table. The joint account transfers, the structure file for Braxton Civil Group and its holding entities, the property records for 3 commercial assets Elijah had acquired through the holding company in the prior 4 years. She read for 8 minutes. Elijah drank water and waited. The transfers are from the joint account, she said. That's technically marital funds regardless of her intent. We can document and address that in any proceeding. She looked up. The holding company structure is clean. The 3 commercial properties are titled to the entity. The entity predates the marriage by 2 years. Yes, she's never seen the entity documents. She's never asked about them. Patricia set down her pen. The Marcus person. You know who he is? I met him once. He's a partner at a commercial real estate brokerage. Does he know the full picture of your position? Elijah paused a moment. He knows what she knows, which is the salary line and the company truck. Patricia looked at him steadily. And what is the full picture? He told her. He told her about Braxton Civil Group's current contract backlog, just over $14 million across 6 active projects. He told her about the holding company, which held 3 commercial properties in Charlotte and 1 in Greensboro, collectively assessed at $3.8 million with modest leverage. He told her about the private account, not hidden, simply private, established before the marriage, and maintained separately, and never concealed, except by the absence of any direct question. Patricia was quiet through all of it. When he finished, she said, "She is planning to leave a structural engineer who owns 4 commercial properties and runs a firm with $14 million in active contracts, because she believes he is a man with a salary and a work truck." "That is correct," Elijah said. Patricia picked up her pen. "I want you to think carefully about what you want the outcome to look like," she said. "Not just legally, what you want her to understand." He thought about the diary, about his name, written in her cursive, underlined twice, about the phrase, "wasting her best years." "I want the full picture to be visible," he said. "All of it. At once." Clearly, Patricia wrote something. Nodded once. "Thursday, I'll have a complete asset summary prepared. When she files, and based on those transfers she's planning to file soon, our discovery response will be comprehensive." She paused. "There is one more thing." She slid a single sheet across the table. It was a property record printout. The address on it was a commercial building on South Boulevard that Elijah recognized immediately. He had driven past it 100 times. It was 3 blocks from Braxton Civil Group's office. "The brokerage where Marcus works," Patricia said. "Check the ownership record at the bottom." He looked. The building at that address was owned by a limited liability company. He read the company name. He looked at Patricia. "Your holding company purchased that building 14 months ago," she said, "through the management company. You may not have been aware of the tenant composition." He had not been aware of the tenant composition. He looked at the printout for a moment. "He pays rent to you," Elijah said. "Every month," Patricia said. On time, apparently, he set the printout down on the table. He looked at the window. Then, he did something he had not done in several days. He smiled, briefly, quietly, without theater. "Leave that one in the file," he said. He drove from Patricia's office to his Aunt Vera's house in Concord, 63 years old, sharp as anything, who had been his grandmother's closest friend and had inherited the role of keeper of the family's frank assessments along with her recipe box. She lived in a ranch house with a vegetable garden along the back fence and an opinion she delivered the way his grandmother had, directly, without softening, with the underlying warmth that made directness feel like love. She was in the garden when he arrived. She looked at his face when he came through the gate and said, "Sit down." He sat on the garden bench and told her what he knew. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she pulled a dead tomato vine from the soil and set it aside with the authority of someone removing what no longer served. "She measured you wrong," Vera said. "She measured what she could see," he said. "Same thing." Vera brushed her hands together. "Your grandmother used to say that a woman who stops being curious about her husband has started being curious about something else." She looked at him directly. "You're not broken, Elijah. You're just known incorrectly. There's a difference." She paused. "What are you going to build next?" He looked at the garden. "Everything I was already building," he said, correctly, with full documentation. Vera nodded. That was enough. He drove home. He made dinner. He sat across from Camille at the walnut table and listened to her talk about a client, and answered her questions, and asked one of his own. She answered with partial attention. He ate his dinner and watched her perform the end of their marriage from the inside, and he let her perform it, and he was not cruel about it and not cold about it, and when she went upstairs he stayed at the table for a few minutes alone in the quiet, and looked at the grain of the wood running continuous across the join the way his grandfather had taught him. Some things were built to last. Some things were built to reveal, in time, exactly what they were made of. Camille filed 17 days later. Howard had the discovery response ready in 3 weeks. 68 pages, tabbed, with an executive summary on the cover that Patricia had prepared in plain language, so the shape of it was visible before the first tab. The reckoning took place in the conference room of Patricia's firm on a gray February morning, the same month, Elijah noticed, as the month his grandmother had passed, 2 years prior. He sat at one end of the table. Camille sat at the other with her attorney, a woman named Forsyth, who had been given the executive summary the previous afternoon and was carrying herself with the careful stillness of someone who had spent the night revising her assumptions. Marcus was not present. He had not been invited. Patricia distributed the binders. Forsyth opened hers with the controlled expression of someone who had already processed most of the shock. Camille opened hers without knowing yet what she was opening. She read the cover page. Her face did what faces did when understanding arrived without warning, not dramatically, not with audible response, but in the specific small ways that registered as truth-landing. The set of her eyes changed. The quality of her attention changed. She turned to the first tab. The properties. The contracts. The holding entity established 6 years before they had met. The total asset picture that had been present in their shared life without her knowledge, not because it had been concealed, but because she had, at some point, stopped asking what she was living beside. She turned to tab 4. It was the property record for the building on South Boulevard. She looked at it for a long moment. She looked up at Elijah. He met her eyes and waited. "You own the building," she said. "The holding company does, yes." She looked back at the page. "He works there. He leases there," Elijah said. "Month to month. Terms adjust at renewal." Forsyth said something to Patricia about the asset classification timeline. Patricia answered with precision. The legal conversation continued. Camille set the binder down and looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked at the window. Then she looked at Elijah again, and this time there was no performance in it, no composed blankness, no managed presentation. She simply looked at him the way a person looked at something they had been standing next to for 7 years without accurately seeing. "I didn't know," she said. "I know you didn't," he said. His voice was level, without heat or score. "You stopped asking, Camille. Somewhere around year 3 you decided what I was, and you stopped looking." He paused. "That was your decision. I'm not here to make you feel badly about it. I'm here to make sure you understand the full picture before anything is resolved." She was quiet. "Your diary," she began. "I read 1 page," he said. "It was open on the counter. My name was on it." He let that settle. "I didn't go looking for it. But I read it, and then I did what I always do. I gathered the information I needed and I made a plan." Forsyth interjected. The procedural conversation resumed. Elijah folded his hands on the table and let the attorneys work, and looked at the window and the gray February light, and thought about his grandmother, who had told him that a person's private words were their architecture, and you did not walk uninvited through another person's walls. He had not been invited, but the door had been left open, and he had walked through it, and he had built the rest on what he found there. He stood when the meeting concluded. He gathered his copy of the binder. He looked at Camille once more. She was still seated, still looking at the property record in tab 4, and he said, quietly, "Take care of yourself." He did not look back. The gray light followed him to the elevator. He rode it down alone and walked out into the February morning and stood on the sidewalk and breathed the cold air and thought about foundations and about the particular patience required to build something that would still be standing when everything else had settled. He went back to the office. He had a 1:30 with the project team on the Morrison Bridge contract. He did not want to be late. 15 months later, Elijah was framing the back addition on a property he had purchased in Plaza Midwood, a craftsman bungalow on a corner lot that he had been working on in the hours between projects. The way he always worked on something with his hands when his mind needed the particular piece of physical precision. It was a Saturday morning in May, cool and clear, the kind of morning that made Charlotte feel like a gift. He had the framing square and the level and a thermos of coffee and the radio playing low, and he worked through the morning with the focused quiet of a man who was exactly where he intended to be. Naomi had come to the site twice, which was how she engaged with most things he cared about. Not performing interest, but actually exercising it, asking specific questions, catching a discrepancy in his joist spacing that he had already flagged, and noting it independently, which had told him more about her than an hour of conversation would have. She was a project manager at a construction management firm, precise and unhurried, curious in the way that came from genuine engagement rather than the desire to appear engaged. She had not asked about Camille until he brought it up himself. She had listened when he did. She had not offered a verdict. She was not the center of this story. She was the reason the next chapter was worth the work. Braxton Civil Group had added a 4th contract manager in January and opened a satellite office in Raleigh. The Morrison Bridge project, a public infrastructure contract worth $9.2 million, was 18% ahead of schedule. Winston had identified 2 acquisition targets for the holding company that Elijah was reviewing at his own pace. Without urgency, he had heard about Camille through his cousin Jerome, who mentioned it the way people mentioned things they assumed you had already made your peace with. She was in Charlotte still, at a smaller firm, boutique residential, a step back from the commercial scale she had been building toward. The interior architecture circle was not large, and the story had moved through it the way stories moved through professional circles, without malice, but completely. Her anchor-client relationship, a hotel developer she had cultivated for 2 years, had not renewed after the proceedings became partially public. The network had recalibrated. Marcus had vacated the South Boulevard building 4 months ago. At the end of his lease term, Elijah had not renewed it. The space had been re-tenanted within 6 weeks at a higher monthly rate. He had noted this in the monthly property report from the management company and moved on. He did not think about any of it often. When it surfaced, it was briefly, with the detachment he brought to closed projects, understanding the outcome, learning what was learnable, filing it where it belonged. He was at the top of a ladder now, checking the ledger board he had set the previous weekend, running his thumb along the connection points with the trained attention of someone who knew that the places you couldn't easily see were the places that most required looking. The morning light was full across the bungalow's roofline. A cardinal had been working the yard since 7 and was still at it, indifferent to the construction. His grandmother had told him to measure twice and build once and know what he was building before he started. He had done all 3. He climbed down the ladder and picked up his coffee and stood in the unfinished frame of the addition, the skeletal shape of a room that did not yet exist, but would, because he had drawn the plans and pulled the permits and set the ledger correctly and checked the connection points himself, and he looked out through the open framing at the May morning and the corner lot and the street beyond it, quiet and sun-warmed and fully his. He was free. He was solvent. He was unbothered. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.